And our opening keynote is Casey Pfizer. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Information Science at the University of Colorado Boulder. A scholar, computing research, and legal scholar, she holds a PhD in human-centered computing from the Georgia Institute of Technology and a JD from, I'm not going to say this right, Vanderbilt, is that right? University Law School. And I'm really excited because of the work that Casey does with Archive NRM and Transformative Works. So I'm going to hand you over to Casey, who'll be able to say much more about herself and what she does. Thank you very much. Please welcome Casey.
Hi, I'm actually going to start talking while I do the awkward laptop switching thing. So I am currently a professor in information science at the University of Colorado Boulder. We're actually a brand new department if you've never heard of us. And unlike many of you who might come out of information science, we actually don't have a relationship to a library science school. However, I love librarians. You're some of my favorite people, for those of you who are. Was anyone at LIDA in November? I feel like there might be some overlap. And I spoke there, but this is completely different, a completely different side of my work that I'm really excited about sharing. It might be helpful if I started things up. All right. Oh, maybe not from the last slide, though. Sorry, spoiler, at the ending, I'm thanking you all for listening to my talk. Oh, perfect. So when I was a law student, and this is quite a long time ago, I started working with a brand new organization called the Organization for Transformative Works. So I've been on their legal committee since 2009. I have also done some research around a fan fiction archive that this organization runs. And so I presented a couple of papers about this archive to computer science audiences, but I've never gotten to give a big talk just about why it's cool. So I'm super excited about this. And if you want to go ahead and look up what I'm talking about, the website is archiveofourown.org. First of all, just in case there are some people here who don't know what fan fiction is, who knows what fan fiction is? I'm not going to ask who's written fan fiction. I have. I started out writing Star Trek fan fiction on Usenet in the late 90s. So fan fiction is stories based on other people's worlds, the continuing adventures of Captain Kirk or Harry Potter, etc. And fan fiction has been going on for a really long time. It was not invented with the internet. Some people trace media fandom back to like Sherlock Holmes book clubs, though really what we think of today as media fandom started more with original Star Trek, and people were creating zines in the 60s and later, still some today. So if you were writing fan fiction and you wanted to share it with the community, we're talking staples and stamps. A little bit later, Xerox machines, maybe you're passing things out at conventions. And so imagine how amazing it was when we had the internet and you could share with everyone. And Usenet was a really popular gathering place for fans in the 90s. There's been a lot of migration of fan communities, which I'll talk about a little bit later as well. Email lists were very popular in the early 2000s. LiveJournal became a very popular place for fan fiction in the mid-2000s. And all along the way, there's also been repositories of fan fiction for individual fandoms, for specific pairings, an entire website just for Buffy Spike fan fiction, or things like this. In 2007, I'm going to give you the sort of 10-second history of Archive of Our Own to start, and it starts with bad things happening. So the first one was that LiveJournal, which was a big gathering place at the time, had some policy changes that made the community feel unwelcome there. Some design changes as well. Definitions of what constituted obscene content, for example, and a lot of journals were deleted by LiveJournal. And if there had been hashtags at the time, it would have been hashtag strike through. It was this big thing, and basically a bunch of people left LiveJournal mass exodus. Around the same time, and remember this was right when user-generated content was becoming really popular, I'm imagining, and I've always imagined in my head a VC meeting where someone was like, this YouTube thing. So this is great. All of these people are creating content for free, and we have figured out how to make money from it, and we need to figure out what the next YouTube is. And then someone said, you know, there's this thing called fan fiction, and people have been creating it, and no one's making money off of it. How do we make money off of this thing that people have been doing already? And so there is a site called FanLib, and the idea behind it was that the people who created this site made deals with media properties. And then they tried to recruit fan fiction writers to come write for their site. And there were ads all over it and other ways that they were monetizing this. Something that's important about the fan fiction community is that it's always been predominantly women. Lots of women in fandom, lots of queer people in fandom. And so you might be surprised that this was the ad that they used to advertise FanLib, that you can, bulk up and become strong by sharing your fan fiction. But this might have been because every single person who worked on the site and the entire board were all men. And so these two things together really highlighted a problem in the fandom community, which was that they felt that they didn't have a space of their own. And so this opened up the possibility for them to be exploited or to be kicked off of spaces, to feel unwelcome. And so a very popular fan fiction writer at the time wrote a blog post that went viral. The suggestion was that they should stop using technologies created by other people who didn't care about their communities. She pointed out that, hey, we've got project managers in this community, we have coders, we have designers. We could just do this ourselves. We could come up with a site that would be better, more attractive to fanfic writers, better than anything else out there, because we're the ones who use it. We need a central archive of our own, which is a great idea. And unlike many great ideas, this one actually came to fruition. So this is Archive of Our Own today. It started out, as expressed to me by many of my interview participants, with 3 women in an apartment who just started building the thing. And it involved a design process with really extensive input from the community, taking into account the things that they really needed and that they wanted to feel like this was their own space. Every time I give a talk about this, and I've been publishing papers for a couple of years about Archive of Our Own, I have to take a new screenshot because this always changes wildly. So as of 2 days ago, there are 1.5 million users and almost 4 million individual works on the site. Right now it's just fan fiction. There are some ways to embed or link to other kinds of fan works like remix videos or art, but primarily this is fan fiction. You will find on the site stories about literally any source material you can think of. I challenge you to come up with something that there is not fan fiction for. So from a couple, from hundreds of thousands of stories set in the Marvel universe to more obscure things, one of my favorite is there's at least one story about anthropomorphized universities and their romance. This is one of my favorites. So besides my involvement in the legal committee of the umbrella organization that runs Archive of Our Own, I've always been very interested in it as an example of really amazing design for a community that already existed. And in particular, this hugely successful platform, which is also open source, was developed, designed, coded, maintained almost entirely by women, which is really remarkable if you consider the proportion of women in the open source community. So I was very interested in learning more about the design process behind this community, and over about a year, I did some related research studies, and overall talked to about 30 people, both people who have worked on the development of the site, people who staff it in various ways, and users about how this all works. How is it designed? How is this happening? And what are the things that are different about it than other kinds of similar sites? I was thinking about the things that might be interesting and important to this particular community, and I came up with three actually quite related themes that I'm going to talk about. The first one is the idea of empowerment with respect to this community, which, as I mentioned, was one of the reasons that this site was created in the first place. And also ideas around inclusivity and openness in both the design and in the community. And finally, preservation, which of course is really important for the theme of this particular conference. So the first thing about empowerment is that it wasn't only the primary motivation for starting this site, but it's been really important for the functioning and evolution of the site as it's continued. Even this original blog post could basically be seen as requirements gathering. There was a ton of input from the community, both before it was built, while it was being built, and even to this day. People are allowed to input suggestions, et cetera. The developers are also very open about talking about things before they implement them. And one of the reasons that this is so integral is that it was a core value when they decided to build this, that it was built by them. Naomi Novik, who is a science fiction writer you might be familiar with, is actually the person who really spearheaded the development of the archive. She was also a computer scientist before she started writing fan fiction and science fiction novels. So she pointed out that we needed to say, this is the front page of our community, this is us, this is for everyone, this is what fan fiction is. And that meant that the people who were building it were part of the community, which of course is a problem as well, because, hey, how are we going to get enough people, not just to build this thing, but to maintain it? We're going to have to grow our own, which becomes really important, and I'll talk about a little bit later how that's had some challenges as well. But this was really a core idea, is that this whole thing was being built by the people who were using it. And a lot of my participants that I talked to in interviewing about the archive pointed out how different this was than a lot of other technologies that they were using. That changes on other websites come from companies not listening to us, but just being like, we think this would be better. And those changes sometimes aren't what the community wants. So one of the users that I talked to described the site as being user-driven, as opposed to by other kinds of interests, for example. A lot of people that I talked to actually directly contrasted Archive of Our Own to LiveJournal, because that was where a lot of them kind of migrated from. Another thing that's really important when it came to empowering this community was embedding the values that already existed into the design of the site. This could be design features. A more direct way to do this is in thinking about policy. So one thing is that there is a mission statement that is quite clear about what the organization is, what it does, what they believe, which is actually then really important, because another part of the kind of mission around the Organization for Transformative Works in general, which is the nonprofit that helps run this, is that we believe that fan works are transformative, and that transformative works are legitimate. This means both that fan fiction is not a thing to be poo-pooed. It is a legitimate art form. It's really important. Also, it's legal. Of course, how I got into this whole thing is that I am a copyright scholar as part of my work, and of course, one could have debates about fair use, fair dealing, and fan works, but I will defend it to my dying breath that it is almost certainly certainly fair use, though of course this becomes complicated in certain kinds of situations. But one of the things that the organization is devoted to is preserving the legal rights and advocating for the legal rights of fan creators. They also reiterate these kinds of values-based things in their terms of service. A few years ago, I did a study of terms of service for lots of different social media and user-generated content sites. I was specifically looking at copyright licenses, but one of the things that I was thinking about was how readable and legible these kinds of documents are. And Archive of Our Own is one of very few terms of service out there that has plain language explanations for things. It not only presents it in a readable way, but tells you why things are the way they are, by having, for example, a list of things that we believe. Something that can be really difficult in thinking about any kind of archive is content policy. And this is something that has been really interesting with respect to the evolution of the archive. Again, one of the things that originally sparked it being created in the first place was there are some places where we feel unwelcome because, for example, they might change where the goal lines are for what's considered obscene content. So there was a very specific decision made at the beginning of the archive, which was that the line that was drawn for content was legality. And that's it. There would be no value judgments about what was allowed on the archive, which is something that is included in the terms of service by mentioning that unless it violates some policy, which could be, again, legal things like if it was copyright infringement via plagiarism, or if it was harassment, et cetera, that we won't remove content for offensiveness, no matter how awful, repugnant, or badly spelled we personally find the content to be. This is sometimes a difficult position to take. Being on the legal committee, we often get sent abuse tickets when someone says, hey, this story is terrible. This is a thing that should not exist in the world. And then we have to draw straws and see who's gonna go look at it and see what it is. But if it's not illegal, it can stay. This is, again, difficult decisions to make, but the problem is that if you you have to make a value judgment somewhere if that's not where you're drawing the line. And there are some people who would find fan fiction that was adult in nature at all to be bad. Some people would find a fan fiction about queer characters to be bad. And so this is a way to specifically state that we are not making the value judgments here. However, it's still really important that people be aware of what they might come across, and that we do our best to protect people from things that they might find upsetting or triggering. And so there are some design things that have gone into dealing with this. And these were also based on the values that already existed in the community. So here's an example of a fan fiction listing. You'll see there's these little icons up there, and they all mean different things. G means that it's G-rated. There's a rating system. The little circle means that it's a finished story, because the worst thing is to read a story and then it is not finished and hasn't been updated in 10 years. So this was something that like the community had decided is really important to know. And the little exclamation point means that there is a warning, a required warning on this story. So years of people writing fan fiction and posting it in various places had solidified the kinds of things that people warn for. And we already knew kind of what those were. Things like graphic depictions of violence or major character death, these kinds of things. And so the way that this is built into the content system is that if any of these things exist in your story, you have to mark them. And if you're not sure, or if you're afraid that whatever that thing is might be a spoiler, or you just don't want to, then there's a box for choosing not to use warnings, which then basically becomes a read at your own risk kind of thing. But a lot of the things actually in just the way this information is presented were kind of based on the conventions that already existed around how people categorized fan fiction. Another thing to think about in terms of design is whether you can design to influence or to push values in a certain direction that might be important to the community. One of the things that came up in this initial blog post was, well, is it going to be okay for us to remix remixes? Like, can we write a sequel to someone's story? And some people were saying, oh, you need to make that so that it's not allowed. And there was actually a lot of tension in the fan fiction community about whether this is okay. And then some other people will describe it as hypocritical. Well, oh, if you're remixing Harry Potter, then obviously someone should be able to remix your remix of Harry Potter. Though there's still some kind of debate around this. There's a design feature in the archive that surfaces this problem in order to make it very clear that you can do it. And this is basically that if you are writing something that is inspired by someone else's fan work, you can mark it and it'll link to it, and it will notify the person if they have an account, etc. So they not only implemented this suggestion, they specifically created a design feature to encourage remixing, but with the value of attribution embedded into it. So it's not okay to do this if you don't attribute it to the original author. And when I was talking to Naomi about this design decision, she said that it was a way to get ahead of the broader community's values. Another interview participant that I talked to used to run a Harry Potter archive in the early 2000s and said that they did a very similar thing with getting ahead of values around whether queer fan fiction was okay by making it a very explicit category in their archive. So the next thing I want to talk about is inclusivity and openness. And actually all of these things tie together quite well. Archive of Our Own has a diversity statement that says, you are welcome here. Someone that I talked to said, you know, at some point we had to decide who can use the site, like what is a fan? And we decided, if you think you're a fan, you are a fan. Everyone is welcome here. And a lot of people that I talked to mentioned this culture of inclusivity in fandom as a whole, but then really appreciating how it was implemented in AO3. So some of these are things that you might think about. So for example, there's a lot of attention to accessibility on the website. Considering that it's built entirely by a team of volunteers, it is more accessible than many websites that have lots of money behind their development, for example. So developers mentioned this to me, that they do a lot of work to get feedback from people who use assistive technology, for example, and some of the users as well mentioned how well this works. For example, appreciating the thought that was built into it, particularly for things like people who have vision problems, use screen readers. And unfortunately, this resource problem does mean that they haven't been able to do automatic translations for stories or even for the entire site. That's a rather difficult thing to do for volunteers. However, what they could do was get people who use the archive to volunteer to translate it. And so because fandom is international, it's not just English-speaking writers and readers, there is this small army of volunteers who have translated all of the documentation on AO3 into over 20 languages. The site also supports fan translations of stories. So just like you could do the remix thing with attribution, you could also create a translation of a story that already exists and add it to the site in that same way. The next thing is one of my favorite features of AO3, and I get this kind of like librarian geeking out about this particular thing, which is the search system on Archive of Our Own, which is a curated folksonomy. This is actually what people talk to me about the most when I would say, hey, what do you like about AO3? Oh my God, it's so searchable. It's amazing. But also they're not limiting how I can categorize things or how I can search for things. So this shows some of the more popular tags on the site. So when you create a story, you can tag it using whatever words you want. You can use things that people might use all the time for kind of genre conventions, but you could make up your own words if you wanted to. You could describe characters in the way that you want to, situations in the way that you want to, and of course, that would seem like it would create a big problem for searchability. Like this is a trade-off, right? So if you have check boxes that you can check, then it becomes a very automatically easily searchable site. If you let people use open tags, it becomes more difficult. So while this may look like the tags on any other site, what's behind it is this complex infrastructure that's supported by an army of volunteers. They're called tag wranglers. And what they do is there are people who are assigned to certain fandoms, and they go through and say, oh, this person tagged mermaid, and this person tagged merlady, and those are actually the same thing. And so behind the scenes, we're connecting them, and now there is merpeople, and all of these things are part of merpeople. One of the reasons that this was important, one of the developers that I talked to said, we knew that people wanted to call things by different names. So if you wanted to write a Buffy Spike fic and you wanted to call it Spuffy, we didn't want to stop you from doing that. Thinking about how to manage creating tags particularly for a infinite universe of source texts, what people want to be able to say, they thought that this was really important. And so they embedded this tagging system in from the beginning. But it never would have worked if they didn't have enough volunteers. There's no way. It probably would have been the death knell for the site if they hadn't gotten enough volunteers to do tag wrangling. But it's been running along quite well. And this is kind of a silly example if you want to use the word spuffy. There's something else that people mentioned to me were things like being able to use the words that you wanted to describe different kinds of sexuality, different kinds of gender identification. And people saw this as a way of promoting inclusivity on the site and another way of being open to all kinds of people who might want to use it. So now I'm going to talk a bit about preservation, starting with why this is so important for fandom in particular. So just a few months ago, I conducted a large-scale survey of fandom participants about how they've migrated across platforms over time. So the requirement for people who were participating in this survey was that you had to have been in fandom in some way, even non-consecutively, for 10 years or more. And you can see from this graph that there have been some very popular platforms that have been kind of gone away. It makes sense that something like Usenet is not really popular much anymore. Email lists, again, because we've just gotten better technology. Because fandom is this technology agnostic community, it means that they're not tied to any particular thing. It's not like, oh, the community of YouTubers are on YouTube. Like, if YouTube went away, they might go to somewhere else, but it wouldn't quite be the same. Whereas fandom kind of migrates with technology. You lose things along the way, of course, and that's actually the problem here. I'll also point out that the lines that are going up are Archive of Our Own and Tumblr, kind of this nice little BFF. They're just around following each other along. One of the interesting things is that they had to get to a critical mass before LiveJournal started to drop off precipitously, because people have to have a place to go. I think that if Archive of Our Own hadn't been invented, that fandom would either still be largely on LiveJournal or would just be more fragmented than it is now, because I think there would be lots of different sites that people were using. But every time you move, you lose something. So if we have 100 different fandom-specific archives for Tolkien and Harry Potter and Star Trek and Buffy, and then one of them shuts down because it was run by some random person when they were in college, and then they got a job and didn't have time to run it anymore, or you weren't able to pay for the server anymore, and then it's just gone. Or it might be even worse. It might be something like all of GeoCities just being gone. And GeoCities had a lot of fan fiction on it, and then they're just gone. So this is one problem that was really important, the idea of preserving fan works, and also preserving fan history. How many of you know what fanvidding is? You ever heard of this term? So what you might think of today is like a remix video. So people, splicing together pieces of TV shows or movies, or lip sync readings, or remix videos are huge now, right? And when YouTube became a thing, like around the mid-2000s, there are all these news articles that are about like, oh, this amazing new art form of video remix. And it's like, well, women in fandom have been doing this since the 80s using VCRs. So fanvids are actually a really, an art form that have been around for a long time. The basic idea is that you're cutting together scenes from movie or TV shows set to a single song. And again, doing this with VCRs. So there are a couple of interesting things here with respect to preservation. One is the preservation of fan history and making sure that these contributions aren't just being erased. So how do we talk about these things? A related issue is that fanvidding, more so than fan fiction, has always been a much more precarious copyright space. And so this can happen, right? This is more the direct topic of most of my dissertation work, was what happens when this happens? How are people navigating this kind of complex copyright space in online communities? And one thing that was happening was, because there was this long-standing kind of fear, because before user-generated content, there was no test case for this, right? So there had been a long history of people creating fanvids being very careful about how they shared them. So very resistant to central archives where they could be found easily. One of my interview participants said that she only shares fanvids on her website under password protection, because once she got a video taken down from YouTube and has been kind of scared since then. There's this really great article by Francesca Coppa and Rebecca Tushnick called How to Suppress Women's Remix. And it talks about these kinds of issues and why this was different than this new, like, yay, wild, wild west of remix videos, and why you didn't have the same kinds of problems. So there are some different solutions to all of these kind of related things when it comes to preservation of fan content and fan history. One is Fanlore, which is a wiki. So this was created around the same time as Archive of Our Own, and it's dedicated to preserving fan history. I could talk a lot more about this. There's been some very interesting copyright tensions, for example, but that's the basic gist, is that one thing we need to do is just write it down. So you can find, for example, pages on, hundreds of different fanzines, that might otherwise be lost to history. But one of my favorite features about this is something called open doors. So this idea was, if we really want to help preservation of content for things like GeoCities being shut down, and we want to be able to help provide a central repository, then we should be open to whatever kind of content people want to give us, including just being able to import archives from other places. And so the Open Doors project is basically someone who runs an archive, because again, there were many, many like fandom specific and other kinds of archives that existed before this one. You can say, hey, I would like this to just be sucked into Archive of Our Own. And there's a process with notifying authors who are there, et cetera. But this has been pretty successful. It's saved a few things from GeoCities, though mostly it's been people who don't have the time or resources to run things anymore have been able to offload that, and it's been really helpful. So for example, here is a Firefly archive where now it becomes a special collection in Archive of Our Own so that you can find it, that it's all tied together. There's also an interesting tension when it comes to preserving history and fandom, and that's that there's sometimes this tension between history and control. So for example, this is something that Naomi also spoke to me about. A lot of people have wanted to make sure that they could wipe out their Finnish identity in an instant if they had to. They want to be able to disappear. So, for example, I'm 30 now, and maybe I don't want people reading the Pokemon fan fiction I wrote when I was 10, or some of the things I wrote might have been on the naughty side, and now I'm going through a divorce, and I'm afraid that my spouse might find them, or whatever it is. These are the kinds of stories I've heard. But it's also just important that people have control over their content, right? You don't want to say, oh, once this is out there, it's just out there forever. I'm sorry. And of course, there are some sites that work like that, but that was not a value that this particular community wanted to propagate. But then the problem is when people do this, it'll just wipe out, again, entire swaths of history, of content. And so they tried to think of something they could do to mitigate this tension. And so the design feature here is something called orphaning. So if you have stories on Archive of Our Own, and you want to delete them, we might say, are you sure you want to delete these forever? Is it that you want the stories gone, or is it just that you want your identity gone, that you want it not to be tied together anymore? So you can orphan a story which removes all traces of your connection to it, and it's permanent. You cannot get it back, because that would kind of defeat the purpose, and we would also have to verify that you were who you said you were, etc. So this is a permanent action, but it means that there's a way for people to have control to delete their connection to things without having to actually destroy the content itself. And this has worked pretty well. And so the last thing I'm going to talk about is this idea of growing their own, and the good things and the bad things about this. So again, the idea here was that we want fans doing this. We want fans to be the ones who are doing the development, who are doing the designing, who are making decisions based on the values of this community, which means we're going to have to grow our own. One of the developers that I talked to, actually, I'm not sure if this is still true, but at the time she was one of the heads of the development team, learned to code by working on the archive. So she thought it was a great idea and wanted to help. She already kind of had this interest in learning. She'd been wanting to learn Ruby on Rails, but this gave her an excuse, and it was something that she was passionate about. And I heard this story a lot. One of the things that's really kind of remarkable, again, about this is that, you know, we have this lack of women in computer science in general, but particularly in open source communities. And of course, there's been a lot of research about some of the reasons for this. Open source, some other projects, Wikipedia, have this kind of acrimonious culture that sometimes can drive women away in particular. Happened to me in both places, actually. So one of the things that was different about this environment was that it was not like that. So I talked to a lot of the people who worked on the development at various points, and they would tell me these really nice stories about coming into the project, that, you know, they weren't being, bad things weren't happening when they messed up, but they were being allowed to fail. One of my participants described this as being a loving environment. She was specifically contrasting to other open source projects she'd been involved in at the time. And this also wasn't super surprising, because what had happened was the broader culture of fandom around this same kind of thing was making its way into a technical development process. There's been a ton of research about fan fiction as a place for learning literacy skills, for example. And some folks in my field wrote a paper a few years ago called Thousands of Positive Reviews, in which they were looking at the reviews of fan fiction on fanfiction.net and were kind of like, wow, everyone's so nice. And there's always been this kind of culture of being encouraging. I mean, of course, there's harassment, there's bad things, there isn't literally anywhere, and this is not immune, but if you compared it to a lot of other places, it really would look a lot nicer. There's also been a long history of people learning technical skills around things like HTML and video editing, just so that they can contribute to the thing that they love. So the idea that I'm going to learn to code so that I can help with this archive because I love it, it's really kind of powerful. And this was something that was appreciated by the people who use the site too. They could see it, that the people who were involved in the running of the site were doing it because they loved the community, that they weren't going to make changes like adding advertisements, that the whole thing was a labor of love. So this is one of the things that kind of makes the whole thing go. Of course, there are challenges to this as well. So one is that, again, you need an army of volunteers to make this thing work. So if we ever ran out of tag wranglers, I don't know what we'd do. Also, this idea of training up new people while also working on the archive sometimes results in an expertise bottleneck. So there's been a fairly significant burnout rate among developers because of this. So I need to be doing things to help the archive, to build new features, but also I'm training other people, and that's a lot of work. So this is something that I have been thinking about how we might better support this kind of thing. I've also thought a lot about what kinds of lessons could we learn for other kinds of communities. Like, is there something here that's like the key to making open source friendlier to women, for example? And I don't really know the answer to that yet. But I do think that something that it suggests is that a community of people really can build their own thing. That if you get enough momentum behind it, what was instigating all of this computational learning, all of this work, etc., it was we love this thing so much, and we love this community so much that we're going to put in the work, and it's been sustainable. So I went into beta in 2008, so 10 years now, and there's no signs of slowing down. In some of all of the sorts of things that I've talked about, I think this is a really great example, not only of these kind of values around openness, of a repository like this that could be really successful, but of the power of community in doing something together and all of the good things that could come out of it. So I want to briefly thank co-authors and collaborators that I had on some of this work, particularly my PhD advisor, Amy Bruckman, who also funded me while I was doing some of this work. If you want to learn more about a lot of the things that I've talked about, these are 2 papers that I've written about this, and yay, open access, everything's on my website. And I would love to take questions, as well as you're welcome to talk to me any other time about any of this. Thank you. Sure, yes. Yeah, so the question is whether there's a whether there's a relationship here to something like Facebook, who says we're just a media platform, we're not responsible for the content, which is something I think about a lot, actually. My other big area of research is technology ethics. So I will say that one of the things that AO3 abuse deals with fairly well is things like harassment, which I think is one of the big things that have been an issue for content. So that's something that's taken very seriously. I mean, the issue that becomes more difficult is like, oh, this story is about something objectionable or something that I find triggering. And so the attempts to use design to warn people about what the content of stories is, for example, is a way of dealing with that, just so that you're not having to make this value judgment. I will say it's been difficult. That's a tricky kind of thing to deal with. But again, it's where to draw that line when it comes to values if it's not something that is illegal. So the related thing to that is that if someone does break these rules about what has to be warned for, et cetera, that's a terms of service violation. So at the very least, we can make people aware as much as possible. But this is it's a really tricky thing, particularly because this isn't like Facebook where it's like, oh, we don't care about the content. I think people do care and feel connected to it. They're just not wanting to make policy decisions about what kind of content is objectively bad.
So I was very interested in your comment about what was it called, where you can remove all your connections to being the author of a piece. And so since I work on a repository for scientific data, of course, this idea of anonymity is kind of antithetical to archiving for what I do. And then you just also mentioned this notion of technology ethics, where making yourself anonymous kind of frees you up to do all kinds of things that you might not do otherwise. I mean, I think there's a lot of, at least circumstantial evidence that people on the internet say all kinds of horrible things that they wouldn't say in person because nobody knows it's them saying it. So have you run into that? Or has OA3 run into that? And do you think that there's impacts on that for preservation as well, and possible future scholarly work on this corpus of data?
So fandom, so AO3, but also just fandom in general, has always been pseudonymous. I mean, secrecy or anonymity has always been a really important feature of fandom, and it's not because people want to be horrible. Again, you know, this research by myself and others has shown that it's pretty positive. There's not a lot of harassment, et cetera, happening in this space. But there's always been a ton of stigma around fan fiction. I mean, even me, like, I'm like, yeah, I wrote lots of fan fiction back in the day, but I still don't want anyone to read it. So like, my fan fiction isn't under my real name anywhere. Like, I hope no one's gonna find it. So that's always been There was some Star Trek, also a lot of Harry Potter when I was in college. So this has always been a really important value. So actually, I'll mention another design feature that kind of relates to this. So something that can be a problem with pseudonyms is that people have multiple ones. Because, like, you know, when you get your Gmail account, like, your name isn't there because someone already took it, or, you know, you have a different name for when you write Buffy fan fiction versus when you write Star Trek fan fiction. So another thing that the archive does is it lets you connect pseudonyms, which is, again, it's an attempt to help with this kind of archiving, searchability sort of thing. You know, I'm not aware of any circumstances in which orphaning has led to bad consequences around people behaving badly or anything like that. I mean, there's definitely bad behavior. There's bad behavior everywhere. And if anyone sees it, like, legal does occasionally. Like, if it's really bad, then it's going to come to us eventually. And it's so rare that I hope that means that it's not happening a lot. But of course it is. But I will say that this value around pseudonymity is so important that I won't speak for everyone, but I'm pretty sure that there would never be any kind of real name policy or anything in fandom. And again, lots of trade-offs. I mean, this is a huge area of research in social computing right now. These trade-offs between dealing with harassment and anonymity and all of these reasons why people might want to be anonymous. That's not because I want to be mean to people. So I do think it's an interesting area for research too.
Thank you for a really great talk. When it comes to issues of content that might commonly fall under the definition of hate speech or incitement, is that something that falls under your harassment policy, or would this be considered a values judgment?
I don't know that I can speak to this with 100% accuracy, so I want to be careful. Usually harassment means that it has to, so hate speech can fall under harassment, yes. Particularly if it's directed to a particular group of people, or especially if it's a particular person. Yes, so that kind of thing can fall under harassment and other sorts of things. But I haven't seen a lot of examples of it, so I'm not totally sure how it's being implemented. And again, that probably means there's not a lot of problems with it because we tend to see the worst of it.
Okay, so when you were speaking about orphaning,
Sorry. Oh, thank you.
So when you were talking about orphaning, and the reasons people might want to do that, I hopped onto Internet Archive, and wow, AO3 has archived a lot. So do you warn people about that? How does that work?
So, um, again, I'm not sure that I can speak to this 100% because it's not really something that's come up much. Um, yeah, honestly, I could speculate, but I'm afraid to, so I'm not going to. But that's actually a really good point. I mean, this is true for any kind of content online, is that it might be archived elsewhere. And that's I mean, that's a whole other like, oh, let's preserve history, but also people's control. Though unfortunately, we're not running that site, so.
You mentioned kind of the ability to remix being sort of implicitly allowed by this particular website. Have you seen any like interest or usage within the fan fiction writing community with Creative Commons licensing?
Um, so, so the archive itself has a Creative Commons license on it for all of its documentation, etc. We do sometimes people will write to us and say, hey, I want to make my fan fiction more open somehow, and we'll say, well, you can put a Creative Commons license on it if you want to. It's a tricky thing because you own your original fan fiction, but not the underlying characters, etc. This is also what we tell, I mean, we also have a lot of people come to us about plagiarism, which we can absolutely help. So for example, there are a ton of websites that just like suck up content, and we've also had problems with like, oh, someone took my fan fiction, changed the names, and self-published it as a romance novel, and it's being sold on Amazon. And then we're like, here is how you do a DMCA. Because yeah, people absolutely have the rights in their stories. And there have been a couple of times where people have wanted to be more open for whatever reason, and we've pointed them to Creative Commons. But in general, everyone does own the copyright in their work on AO3.
So I know you talked a lot about the sort of case where things sort of fall off the internet or like people want to disassociate themselves, but is there sort of any like thought being put to when someone has like kind of lost their own work, or the person is sort of like not available, but it's sort of central to a bunch of other people's work and they're interested in it? Or
Um, I'm not 100% certain on this, but I'm fairly sure that there have been some circumstances in which the person who was running an archive has completely disappeared, where people who have work in the archive have requested that it could come into Open Doors. I mean, similar sort of thing. You also might not be able to get in touch with every single person who has worked there, and there's various procedures that they go through to try to find everyone who's involved. But again, that can be really difficult, either because it's like a pseudonym, or it was 20 years ago and who knows what's happened to this person now. I mean, that's really tricky. I mean, this brings up a lot of really prickly questions around, again, this tension between preservation and control. So these are some of the better solutions I've seen to it. I'm not sure how other archives handle this kind of thing, but I think it's really interesting.
Yes, so this is very interesting. I'm the member of a community that is much smaller and much less popular, of a specialist topic, like repairing antique refrigerators. But a number of these things have been, relevant to that in the sense that, I've seen it migrate from, different forum software, but basically, that community has like no resources, is very non-technical, and is kind of at the whim of, using, like free forum software that is more interested in ad revenue, et cetera. And so, and so I'm a member of this, and at work, I'm familiar with different techniques for preservation and such. And so I'm just wondering, in that kind of scenario where there's a very small but passionate community, and I'm like the only person who is somewhat technologically conversant. I mean, what would you recommend that someone in my shoes do to make sure that that community doesn't die out?
That's a really good question because it was nice that this was a community that was big enough that it had enough people who knew enough of the technical skills to be able to get things started. Something that I suggest in one of these papers with respect to this problem is what would happen if we took some of these communities and kind of helped them join together. So like another example that I use of a community who built something for themselves is Ravelry. So for knitting, it's a little bit different. I read somewhere that the person who came up with the idea had lots of kind of systems requirements, et cetera, and her spouse was a developer and kind of helped get the thing running. So what if you didn't have that? So what if like you could take knitters and fan fiction writers and refrigerator repair people and connect them in somehow so that they can support each other? I think that would be a really interesting idea. I mean, one of the things is that there are like 1,000 ways this should have failed. It's kind of like how everyone thought Wikipedia was going to fail. Like, clearly this is not going to work because like tragedy of the like it's just not. And I feel similarly to this. And if there hadn't been like those particular 3 women in an apartment who started the thing, if it hadn't been them, if they hadn't been willing to sacrifice, this never would have happened. So it's one of my favorite like success stories of the internet.
Good morning. Thank you for your talk thus far. So I wanted to know, are there ways on this website where people can connect to other users saying, I need somebody to, I'm a writer, but I'm shy. I need somebody to kind of help me get my stuff out there or something like that, or to not necessarily advertise, or is there somebody to say, I'm a writer, but I have no technical ability for computers and things like that, who can help me? Are there ways for people to connect that way?
So Archive of Our Own is only an archive and not a social space, except for comments on stories, etc., which was a specific decision that was made at the time, partly because of resource things, now partly because like if you try to do too much. So that's one of the reasons why, so that graph that I showed that had Archive of Our Own and Tumblr kind of like this, that's in part because where LiveJournal was both social and archive, Tumblr has become kind of the social component, so they connect together fairly well. And so most of the social interaction in fandom is happening outside on Tumblr, on Twitter. A really popular thing now is like Discord and Slack, kind of these sort of chat things. This has actually caused some kind of problems around disconnect of the community feeling more fragmented that people complain about, kind of like, back in the good old days when everything was on LiveJournal. So there are still places for people to connect, but it might be a little more difficult than it used to be. But Archive of Our Own does not kind of have the social element to it.
So we have time for about 1 or 2 more questions.
When you talked about a loving community and sort of people learning to code so that they could support the community and the things that they like, that really resonated with me. But I would have naively assumed that developers working on lots of open source projects would have felt that way. Like, I would expect the Linux kernel maintainers to love what they do, even if they're being paid for it.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about like maybe differing motivations and relationships to projects?
So that's a great point. And I mean, the first paper that I wrote about Archive of Our Own, I presented as like, hey, if a community of people needed a thing and they were going to build it, like, what would that look like? And the example is basically open source. Though the community of people in open source tend to be developers, programmers already, who are then building something. So I mean, there are ways for newcomers to come into open source, but then there's all this research that shows how it's really difficult. And I haven't researched open source myself, so I'm basing this on other people's work. But again, this sort of acrimonious environment, and I'm sure not every open source project, for example. So I think there are a lot of parallels, but something that's different here is that we're talking about people who had no, at least for the newcomers who are coming in, who didn't already have any kind of programming experience. So it's not like, oh, I know how to do this thing, so I'm going to do this thing in this context that I love. It's, I'm going to learn to do a thing so that I can do it in this context that I love. Though I would imagine there's probably other examples too. So can we all thank Casey, please?